corporations owned through a collective investment by the government, whom advertise popular candidates like Obama, knowing that once he is elected he will appoint former, current, and future corporation lobbyists and attorneys, CEOs, and board members into positions favorable to private corporate government no-bid contracts, thus ensuring future revenue generation for the government-owned corporations while generating wealth and kickbacks for the corporate representatives that are appointed by the elected official, namely the President of the United States Corporation, U.S. Inc. Remember, by electing one person as president, you are giving permission to that person to appoint hundreds and hundreds of unelected officials, who then also appoint unelected officials under themselves, and thousands of appointed corporate power brokers with fancy titles like Secretary of State, Chief of Staff, and Secretary of Defense. The point here is this: you do not have a representative government. End of story. For representation requires the majority vote of the public. But in reality, barely 50% of the American population even get out to vote. Therefore, without a 100% vote, our representatives are illegitimate, for there is no way for them to get approval in the form of a vote from 50% of the people when barely 50% of the people vote. Thus, when we hear our politicians and media hounds constantly harping about bringing democracy to the rest of the world, what this really means is that the United States Incorporated wants to expand its business base internationally. Be it oil in Iraq, poppy seeds in Afghanistan, water and mineral rights in South America, or simply the power to use our corporate and United Nations-controlled military to destroy a country's infrastructure so that companies like Halliburton can receive billions in taxpayer money to rebuild what U.S. Inc. destroys. All of this in the name of democracy. Liberal corporatism began to gain adherents in the United States in the late 19th century. Liberal corporatism was an influential component of the progressivism in the United States that has been referred to as interest group liberalism. Fascism's theory of economic corporatism involved the management of sectors of the economy via government or privately controlled organizations, corporations. Each trade union or employer corporation would, in theory, represent its professional concerns, especially through negotiation of labor contracts and the like. This approach, it was theorized, could result in harmony amongst social classes. Authors have noted, however, that de facto economic corporatism was used in specific instances of silencing opposition and rewarding political loyalty. What is corporate governance? It is the set of processes, customs, policies, laws, and institutions affecting the way a corporation or company is directed, administered, or controlled. Corporate governance also includes the relationships among the many stakeholders involved and the goals for which the corporation is governed. The principal stakeholders are the shareholders, the board of directors, employees, customers, creditors, suppliers, and the community at large. Understand, though, that the main goal of a corporation is to make money or make a profit for its shareholders. Oh, and for Mr. Walker, parties involved in corporate governments include the regulatory body, for example, the chief executive officer, the board of directors, management, shareholders, and auditors, which makes the former comptroller general not ignorant, but an accomplice to crime. Other stakeholders who take part include suppliers, employers, creditors, customers, and the community at large. Now, also very important to understand is the next sentence, which states, in corporations, the shareholder delegates decision rights to the manager to act in the principal's best interests. Now let's take a look at the definition of a corporation. A corporation is an institution that is granted a charter recognizing it as a separate legal entity, having its own privileges and liabilities distinct from those of its members. There are many different forms of corporations, most of which are used to conduct business. And for corporate government, business is booming. The word corporation once again derives from corpus, the Latin word for body or a body of people. One type of corporation is called a mutual benefit corporation. A mutual benefit corporation is a corporation formed in the United States solely for the benefit of its members. An example of a mutual benefit corporation is a golf club. Individuals pay to join the club, memberships may be bought and sold, and any property owned by the club is distributed to its members if the club dissolves. The club can decide in its corporate bylaws how many members to have and who can be a member. Corporations can be called clubs, organizations, associations, municipalities, etc., etc. Generally, while it is a non-profit corporation, a mutual benefit corporation is not a charity. If there is a dispute as to how a mutual benefit non-profit corporation is being operated, it is up to the members to resolve the dispute since the corporation exists to solely serve the needs of its membership and not the general public. Very important. In the United States, corporations are created by filling the requisite documents with a particular state government. The process is called incorporation, referring to the abstract concept of clothing the entity with a veil of artificial personhood, embodying or corporating it, corpus being the Latin word for body. Only certain corporations, including banks, are chartered. Once incorporated, the corporation has artificial personhood everywhere it may operate, until such time as the corporation may be dissolved. A corporation that operates in one state while being incorporated in another is a foreign corporation, and we'll talk about that in a moment. A corporation is legally a citizen of the state or other jurisdiction in which it is incorporated. Many large corporations are incorporated in Delaware, for example, without being physically located there because the state has very favorable corporate tax and disclosure laws. As juristic persons, corporations have certain rights that attach to natural persons. In other words, you and me, human beings, natural living beings with a soul. But a corporation has no constitutional right to freely exercise its religion because religious exercise is something that only natural persons can do. That is, only human beings, not business entities, have the necessary faculties of belief and spirituality that enable them to possess and exercise religious beliefs. Once again, because human beings have a soul. And finally, we come to a government-owned corporation. A government-owned corporation, state-owned enterprise, state enterprise, government business enterprise, or parastatal, is a legal entity created by a government to undertake commercial activities on behalf of an owner government. Government-owned corporations can be fully owned or partially owned by government. As a definitional issue, it is difficult to determine categorically what level of state ownership would qualify an entity to be considered as state-owned, since governments can also own regular stock, without implying any special interference. As an example, the Chinese Investment Corporation agreed in 2007 to acquire a 9.9% interest in the global investment bank Morgan Stanley. But it is unlikely that this would qualify the later as a government-owned corporation. Government-owned or state-run enterprises are often the result of corporatization, a process in which government agencies and departments are reorganized as semi-autonomous corporate entities, sometimes with partial shares listed on stock exchanges. The term government-linked company, or GLC, is sometimes used to refer to corporate entities that may be private or public, listed on a stock exchange where an existing government owns a stake using a holding company. There are two main definitions of government-linked companies which are dependent on the proportion of the corporate entity a government owns. One definition purports that a company is classified as a government-linked company if a government owns an effective controlling interest, greater than 50%, while the second definition suggests that any corporate entity that has a government as a shareholder is a government-linked corporation. The problem is, all corporations have the government as a major shareholder. Dow Jones has identified over 100,000 government-owned or controlled corporations in its anti-corruption service. This number far exceeds earlier estimates by the OECD. A quasi-governmental organization, corporation, business, or agency, parastatal, is an entity that is treated by national laws and regulations to be under the guidance of the government, but also separate and autonomous from the government. While the entity may receive some revenue from charging customers for its services, these organizations are often partially or majorly funded by the government. They are usually considered highly important to smooth running of society and are sometimes propped up with cash infusions or bailouts in times of crisis to help surmount situations that would bankrupt a normal, privately owned business. They may also possess law enforcement authority, usually related to their functions. In the United States, the government-sponsored enterprises, or GSEs, are a group of financial services corporations created by the United States Congress. The United States government-sponsored enterprises are private corporations owned by their stockholders, rather than government-owned corporations. Their primary function is to generate profits for their stockholders, but they are structured and regulated by the U.S. government to enhance the availability and reduce the cost of credit to targeted borrowing sectors: agriculture, home finance, and education. Congress created the first government-sponsored enterprise in 1916 with the creation of the Farm Credit System. It initiated government-sponsored enterprises in the home finance segment of the economy with the creation of the Federal Home Loan Banks in 1932. And it targeted education when it chartered Sallie Mae in 1972. Although Congress allowed Sallie Mae to relinquish its government sponsorship and become a fully private institution via legislation in 1995. In other words, a private company bought it after Bush said it was okay. The residential mortgage borrowing segment is by far the largest of the borrowing segments in which the government-sponsored enterprises operate. Together, the three mortgage finance GSEs, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the 12 federal home loan banks have several $1 trillion of on-balance sheet assets. The federal government possesses warrants which, if exercised, would allow them to take a 79.9% ownership share in the companies. Municipal corporations are public corporations that have devolved democratic control over local matters within a geographic region. They are often styled villages, towns, townships, cities, or counties. Though these municipal corporations are often regulated and sometimes financed by the state government, and often can collect taxes, they are arm's-length, non-sovereign, devolved public entities, and a state government which charters them is not legally responsible for their debts in the event of a municipal bankruptcy. So if you have your money invested in a pension fund within a municipality, there is no recourse. You will lose your money in the case of a municipal bankruptcy. Lotteries in the United States are also run by government corporations, such as the Georgia Lottery Corporation and many others. And you wonder why that money never makes it to schools.